Welcome to On the Bubble Podcast, episode 90. I'm your host, Balsa J. Wait on with me is my co-host, Yuki Lee Bender. Today we're going to be doing another Fab Fundamental series talking about fatigue once again. We already did an episode on fatigue on episode 25. This is almost a year and a half ago, and we're going to be going in a lot more depths about more of the active fatigue side compared to the passive fatigue, and we'll talk about all of that in detail. But before we do that, how did your week 3 of your PQ season go?
So I played one PQ this weekend, just a local one. I took -IO to see if that was a deck that I might want to play for Worlds. Before the event, I had mostly written it off and been like, I'm not going to play -IO. Deck's pretty good. It has some problems. I don't know. Fast forward to the event, I ended up going 5-0 in Swiss and then 3-0 in top 8. So 8-0 overall, taking down the event. And the deck felt really, really, really good. I almost got fatigued once by a Florian. Had one other close game. It was the mirror. And then most of my other games did not feel particularly close. So I don't know. -IO is a very interesting hero. When she does her thing, she is extremely unfair. And sometimes your opponent plays like a Warmongers and you're just like, how do I beat this Warmongers? So I think -IO is like a huge question mark for Worlds that I'm trying to figure out. And I think most top teams and players are trying to figure out right now is like, how good is -IO? And I don't know. So fortunately, I won the event. Unfortunately, -IO is now back on the menu, and I'm still even more undecided on deck choice than before the weekend. So overall a big win, but definitely throws a bit of a wrench in the World's testing. If you're interested in -IO, by the way, there is also some content on Patreon. I have a tournament report as well as a how to play guide on -IO that is available either for purchase or for our Titanium Bauble and Up members. If you want to check that out on Patreon, you can. And there's other stuff like Aurora and Florian deck techs as well. How to play guides and deck lists and things like that. So feel free to check that out. And I just want to take a moment to thank the patrons. There's been honestly kind of massive growth in Flesh and Blood just in general with I think a lot of people from Magic coming over, Andrea Mangucci has been getting really into the game and just recently posted a how to play video that was sort of aimed towards new players coming from Magic being able to pick up the game. That was honestly super well done. They were playing the first strike decks. That was a very cool video, and it just seems like there's been a ton of enthusiasm in the game and lots of people interested in content. So yeah, thank you so much to all of our patrons. It really means a lot and helps us keep doing what we're doing. This report has been honestly really, really incredible and more than I would have expected. It kind of felt like people were a little bit down on the game around Mistveil, and we're kind of at a bit of a high point right now for sure.
Yeah, I think the banning of the Zen cards in the books has a big effect on that.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that as much as -IO might be really powerful, at least for now, things that seem pretty diverse and pretty healthy. The ProQuest metagame looks, there are some top decks for sure, but there's kind of 5 or 6 or 7 kind of top decks, which is honestly quite a lot. There's 30 heroes, not all of them are great, but 5 to 7 very good decks that are winning lots of events is a pretty good sign for the health of the game. And I'm very curious to see what -IO will do next week. I believe she had 10 wins this week, coming in somewhere around maybe 3rd or 4th, I think, overall in number of wins. So having a good representation, but it also being early for her. But then I also think decks can adapt to her. So there's kind of a lot of layers to this metagame, and it feels like it keeps shifting and evolving, which is usually the sign of a great metagame.
Yeah, that's fair. I ended up also playing the PQ that Yuki won. I actually didn't top 8 this one. I came 9th, mostly because in round 1, I was playing... I guess I should say which deck I was playing first. I was playing on Aurora, and on the first 2 turns of the game, I forgot it was turn 1 or turn 2, but I ended up attacking with Entwine Lightning, fusing it, and then I proceeded to pitch a blue, make a rune chant with my grasp, and then attack with Starfall. And then my opponent proceeds to go, Starfall is for 1, and I go, oh, I guess it is for 1. and then I have 2 cards left in my hand, an arsenal card, and I just drew up 2 and passed the turn back to him. So, yeah, that was my PQ.
Yeah. Entwine Lightning, not actually a lightning card. It's honestly an easy mistake to make. I've made that mistake. I've seen a lot of other people make the same mistake as well. So yeah, be careful of that if you're playing Aurora for sure. You played a second PQ on the Saturday as well, right? I think you traveled a bit for it.
Oh, yeah, I also went to, Victoria, which is about a 3 it's like a ferry ride plus a 3-hour drive total, and I came top 4 in that one, and I also played Aurora for that one, and it was that time the deck was very good. I didn't play in Twine Lightning into Starfall, so I didn't lose games like that. But in top 4, I played against the Florian that had a well-timed Plow Under to disrupt my Flicker Arc Lightning combo, and the game got really close, but he ended up beating me by damage by that point. Yeah, but our local won that one, so we got another local that could potentially travel to London with us.
Yeah, very cool. That was I believe Lucas on Enigma, right?
Yeah, Lucas was on Enigma.
And even though I did end up winning the PQ, our other PQ this weekend, Edison, who started the game kind of recently, like within the last year, and has been getting really into it lately, ended up coming in second on Azalea, but getting the invite since I had qualified on a previous tournament. So yeah, really cool to see, like, I guess just like new faces and new locals picking up the game, getting serious, and finding some results. I feel like we've been seeing a lot of different faces in the scene lately, and it sounds like it's kind of similar for a lot of other people from what I hear too, which is very cool.
Yeah, it's great to see new people winning and honestly taking down tournaments. Yeah, but we have a gatekeeper called Yuki Lee Bender in our local scene, so it's tough to win events around here.
Hmm. Now I feel bad.
Yeah, use your PTIs instead of taking PQ spots, right? Yeah, clearly.
It's okay. I only took one invite.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. It was. It's also the smallest turnout one that you took too, so it's fine. Okay, then I guess before we move on to our main topic, I forgot to talk about this last week. I got this question in maybe about 2 weeks ago now. We'll go over this question that one of our listeners brought into us. And Colin asks, one question I have, or maybe something you could add for our future hero breakdowns for Rosetta, is how you use the Runaways equipment the best. Maybe a better way to talk about it is how to use the equipment against heroes instead of with heroes. So yeah, the Runaways equipment is the cycle of equipments from Rosetta that essentially says if you've been dealt damage this turn or if you lost life this turn, you can, as an instant, destroy it and prevent the next one damage. Do you want to just go over like each of the heroes pretty quickly and just talk about when or how to use this cycle of equipments against them?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this is linked to like how frequently the deck does multiple points of damage, and if there's any on hits that can give you more damage. So Verdance is probably the hardest one to get use out of Runaways. The main time you would get this is against her hero ability, where the life gain ping can deal 1, and then she might do something else on the turn to deal you damage, and you can just kind of cash it in there. You can also potentially use it if she surges a Trailblazing Aether or some kind of like Aether Quickening, something like that. You can kind of cash it in. Against Verdance, I usually like cashing it in pretty much right away because there's just not much in the way of on hits to stop from her. Have you felt similarly about Verdance?
Yeah, I think Verdance is like if you have one of these runaway equipments, you have to use it as soon as possible, or you're kind of in the risk of like it rotting on your equipment zone.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing is there's just like not that much reason to save it. Like you're not like getting like you don't have a lot of chances to get extra value, but you do have chances to just like not get value.
Yeah, I agree. And it's like it's not really reliable to stop the surges later in the game either, right?
Yeah, and it's like kind of hard, right? Because like I don't know how to explain it. She needs to like often she can discard like she can play like a Fertile Grounds or a Fruits of the Forest after playing the Surge spell, and the other play pattern is like the Trailblazing Aether into a spell, but like usually she only amps one with the staff. So unless she's specifically going like staff, Trailblazing Aether, gloves, I don't know, perennial Aether Bloom or something, like you're not really gonna get to do that. And so the Runaways equipment stopping Surge is like pretty finicky and not really something you should count on. And I think the same thing is we'll talk about Acilio, but I think the same thing is true for Acilio. It's pretty hard to stop Surge just because both heroes kind of amp once for the most part rather than twice.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Then did you want to talk about Acilio right now?
Yeah, sure. Acilio is another one where I think you should just cash it in when you can. They don't go wide all that often. Usually want to stop the physical attacks when you can, but if you happen to let one through, like maybe there's a lightning surge for 4 and it's just not profitable to block it, you can certainly cash it in on their spell. But for the most part, I'm just trying to get use of the life total as soon as I can because again, they could just start doing like big chunks of arcane with like a Aether quickening, or sorry, like a any scalding rain with an exploding Aether, for example, and just come in for 7 arcane, and you just kind of can't use your runaways. And I think if you leave it, especially, they can sometimes have some counterplay to it, and choose to like prioritize big spells rather than going wide. I don't know if this is like super relevant or valuable, but there is like some kind of funny stuff with like some of the sigils. In particular, I had somebody play the is it Sigil of Aether, the majestic sigil that pings 1, and then at the start of their turn it breaks, pings 1, and then it amps 1 if it dealt damage.
Yep.
I had somebody play that against me, and I took it, and then they did like a flash Volzar gloves. What is the card called? Open the floodgates. Amped for 3, and I had 3 pieces of runaway equipment, and I could stop it because of the Sigil of Aether when I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So there is some like weird stuff with like that Sigil of Aether pinging early, or like Sigil of Temporal Manipulation, flipping a spell off the top. You probably want to think about when you're using that spell and not use it before the thing that has surge, like because it's an instant, you can use it at any time, right? But just make sure that you're using it afterwards, so you're not turning on their runaways equipment if they have it. So yeah, there is some like weird stuff with it, but for the most part, I think you just cash in. I just like happened to have the runaways sitting around still. I wasn't like waiting for that, but I think for the most part, you should just be cashing it in.
Yeah, that makes sense. I wouldn't cash it in or like work to cash it in either, though. It's like if it's pretty natural to block out all the things, I would block it out first. And then if you were to leak damage, and then if you were to leak damage again, that's when I would want to use the Runaways equipment against Cilio.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I wouldn't be like trying to take damage so you can runaways. I think that's probably not very good.
Yeah, mostly if you could just block with your hand.
Yeah, I guess if you like know their stack or something, or like kind of know they're going for a big surge, like maybe you could do that. But I think for the most part, you're not trying to go for a play like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Then I guess the more interesting question would be, what about the Rune Blades? Like, how do you use the Runaways equipments against the Rune Blades?
Yeah, so Florian, I think for the most part, you can cash it in when you want to. There is a little bit of interesting stuff with Meet and Greet as like as a potential on hit that you can stop with it. That also comes in for a breakpoint, so that can be quite relevant. Like you take a rune chant from the Meet and Greet because maybe you can't stop it or you don't want to break your sanctuary, and then you can cover 1 on the Meet and Greet and like block 3 to deny the rune chant. That's kind of like the main thing that comes up against Florian, but kind of once again, I want to cash it in when I can because some Florian decks make a lot of rune chants, and some of them have like a limited amount of rune chants, and some of them make like almost 0, and it's kind of hard to know what type of Florian deck they are on. Like you don't like necessarily know how much rune chant generation they have when you sit down to play the game, I guess is what I mean. So I usually like to just kind of like make use of it when I can, because if you wait too long and they just like don't make any more rune chants, you just might not get value out of it. But again, like if you want to block out already, don't like try to use your runaways equipment just to use it. But it's just like if you leak damage to the rune chants, then you were gonna leak damage a second time, it's usually good to cash it in.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess kind of similar for the Aurora too, right?
Yeah, I think Aurora is a little bit unique in that she goes wide. I think Aurora goes wide reliably enough that you actually get a lot of opportunities to use Runaways, and so this is the matchup where I would be the most inclined to save it for an on hit. They're also the most likely to have on hits. Like Meet and Greet fits in really nicely with this hero. They also might play like Smash Up, the rare. So if you have like two Runaways equipment, you get like a 3 block and two Runaways equipment on the Smash Up. So against Aurora, I'm a little bit more willing to hold this for an on hit, but you don't want to go like too low.
Yeah, the worst case scenario is that like they put you to one, and then if you're at one, you just can't use these runaway equipments anymore either, and you would have to kind of work to try and gain back life to try and use it again. So you really want to use this before you get like below five, right?
Yeah. The other interaction that actually does come up against Aurora that is maybe worth considering is burn up shock, especially if there's multiple runaways equipment. I had a game where like I had a burn up shock and I think my opponent had like 2 to 3 runaways equipment, and I just like I wasn't thinking too much about it. I just played burn up shock for a meld as you would, and then the runaways equipment actually let them block out all the breakpoints. And in retrospect, I think in that exact hand, because I had enough breakpoints, I probably should have just not melted it because I wouldn't have turned on the runaways equipment to be able to like block all my fours. So that's maybe something to keep in mind, and like also another reason to maybe hold back the runaways for a little bit, but not for too long. Because again, like if you're at like 5, right, then and they let's say they choose not to meld the burn up shock, well, the first damage you take is lethal because I mean, I guess you can runaways equipment the burn up shock trigger, but uh, you'd rather deny that burn up shock trigger entirely. So I don't know. There's some interesting counterplay there on both sides, I think.
That's that actually reminds me of a interaction that happened in CC earlier, where my opponent is on my Florian opponent is on what is the anti life gain weapon?
Reaping Blade.
Reaping Blade. Yeah, my opponent was on Reaping Blade, and I was at 2, and he was at 1. He proceeds to play Arcane Seed's life, and he melds it. So he gained a life through Arcane Seed's life on the life part. But what happened was if he just didn't actually meld it and gain the life, there was no opportunity for me to play Sigil of Solace to gain 3 back before his like actual attack would hit, and I would have died. But my opponent played life, gaining a 1 life, which let me gain 3 back from the Sigil of Solace through the
Wouldn't wouldn't you be able to gain the life anyways though, because of the rune chance hitting you?
uh
Like you
no,
could like take one from the rune chant, go down to 1 to 1, and then play Sigil of Solace.
no, because I was too high of a life total to be able to do that. I think it was like 3 to 1, 3 to 2. It's something like that.
Like it was like such a life total where like
The physical,
after the rune chance you were still higher on life, but then the attack was lethal kind of thing.
yeah, like I needed to block with my Sigil of Solace, but I couldn't.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that is.
Yeah,
Huh.
because I can put myself down to 2, is what it was through the rune chance, but then
Hmm.
I couldn't actually play Sigil of Solace. Yeah, but then they gained a life, so we were both at 2. Gain 5, take 4, go to 1.
Hmm. That is pretty interesting. I don't know if I've seen that exact thing come up, but definitely something to be aware of. Could be very relevant. I think that more or less covers the Runaways equipment. I'll say that overall the Runaways equipment is like pretty good in this set. I think it's gone up a little bit for me. Early on, I was like, Runaways is whatever, and I think I've having played more, I'm like, there's definitely better equipment in this set, but Runaways pretty good. What do you think? Are you higher on Runaways than originally?
Or from originally, when you mean originally by like preview season, yes, I'm much higher on it. Like I was kind of like the first time I saw it, I was like, oh, it's like when they first printed Runaways, it was kind of awful because not all the heroes can trigger Runaways essentially, and in this set, all the heroes kind of do trigger the Runaways in some way or another. So it's rarely dead, because of that, it kind of just is one extra life most of the time. So it hasn't I haven't had a game yet where I go, man, this run I never had an opportunity to activate my runaways. So I think it's pretty good for that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also on the flip side, I've definitely had games where like I or my opponent has like not used their runaways, and then at the end of the game they're like, "Huh, if I had that one more life, that'd be pretty good right now."
Yeah, yeah. It's like they saved it and they shouldn't have saved it,
Yeah,
right? Okay, I think we should move on and talk about fatigue before this episode gets too long.
agreed.
Okay, then do you want to first define what fatigue is?
Yeah, so I think fatigue is like kind of a game state where you run out of cards in deck that you can use to win the game. And this usually means by attacking and defending or doing some combination. So sometimes it can literally be you have 0 cards in deck and your opponent has a card and then they can just, I don't know, swing Rotwood Reaper until you die. But sometimes it can also just look like, you know, you are out of cards, you draw up a 3-card hand, they attack you, and you like can't prevent lethal. Or yeah, or like you just like run out of damage. Maybe you're playing Verdance, you don't have a proper weapon, and like you just like don't have enough damage left in your deck to actually kill them. So any of these situations are fatigue. It doesn't literally have to be like 0 cards, but it's typically that you're kind of like out of like threats and or blocking cards, and your lack of cards has kind of made it so that you can no longer win the game.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. When does fatigue come up? I guess it'll be a good question.
I guess fatigue comes up in the super late game. Often it comes up when there's like a controlling deck or a deck that wants to do a fair amount of blocking, because that blocking extends the game. Those games can like sometimes not lose, cannot end by damage and instead end by running out of cards. In Rosetta, this is most commonly the Earth Mirrors, but other games can also come to fatigue. In particular, aggro decks can sometimes fatigue their opponent by, it's usually, it looks a little different. Like you actually get your opponent really low early, you get them to 1, and then you just kind of like keep attacking them with like breakpoints and any annoying attacks you can. You just go, give me all your cards, and you just keep doing that. And because all they're doing is blocking, and you might have like a weapon in there, you're like slowly just kind of chipping away at their deck, and you'll run them out of cards. But yeah, it's usually the controlling decks, but sometimes aggro decks can also win through fatigue.
Okay, that makes sense. Um, I think we talked about this in our earlier episode, like a year ago, on episode 25 about fatigue. But we talked about a concept about fatigue by damage and passive fatigue. Um, if you want to learn a little bit more or just like listen to us talk about that in a little bit more depth, I think I would recommend going back to that episode. But today we're going to be mainly talking about fatigue by damage, whereas the last episode we talked a lot about passive fatigue, which is passive fatigue will be more about blocking, and fatigue by damage is by attacking. And do you agree with me that Rosetta is more fatigue by damage than the passive fatigue in this set?
Yeah, I think Rosetta and Limited in general is almost exclusively fatigue by damage. They seem to have lowered the ability to do passive fatigue because they've kind of like lowered 3-block density. I think the last time we saw it in Limited was Bright Lights with Teklovasen. Like that was a deck very much interested in just like blocking and blocking and blocking until your opponent ran out of threats because they boost away their threats. Um, and even in CC, when Oldham LL'd, we saw a lot less passive fatigue, although we're seeing a little bit of a resurgence with some of these count your blessings decks. If all they're trying to do is attrition you and run you out of threats and gain life, that would be a passive fatigue strategy. And we've also seen a little bit with Dash.io coming out, some decks pivoting to, well, I can't race Dash.io, but she keeps boosting and drawing cards and Teklo Foundry harding, so maybe I can just try to weather the storm and block her out until she runs out of cards. So we have seen like a little bit of a resurgence in passive fatigue, but I think that for the most part the game has shifted towards a more active fatigue by damage style fatigue.
Yeah, and I think it just comes mainly from the set design overall, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
I think from heavy hitters, they've been really increasing the power on the cards and then decreasing the block value. So, like in this set, all of the earth and lightning cards basically block for 2, and because of that, it's kind of hard to get a density of 3 blocks to do passive fatigue damage or passive fatigue in general.
Yeah, and I also think that the big attacks, like there's kind of like been an abundance of these 3 for 7s that trade up on cards that just make active fatigue really really good. Where every time you throw a 3 for 7, your opponent has you're spending 1 card, your opponent blocks with 2 cards, you're going up on cards and deck. So that also helps fatigue by damage be better. And I think they've been just adding a lot more of these cards in. Honestly, just like even in generic, I think every set has like generic 3 for 7s now, and people really understand how good those cards are. So, yeah, honestly, I think I'm a pretty big fan of this change. I think in limited, it really encourages people to be still doing some blocking, but primarily playing with their cards rather than just like pitching them to hammer and blocking the whole game.
That makes sense. Then I guess let's talk about the concept of deck damage. I think that's what we really wanted to talk about today.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you were saying the 3 for 7s is a form of like deck damage, I think, in a way. Do you want to explain what deck damage is?
Yeah, so very simply, I think you can kind of think of deck damage as if you make a play that trades up on cards in deck, you're pulling ahead in deck damage, or kind of like conversely, like deck health. Your deck is healthier than theirs, or you're dealing damage to their deck, however you want to think about it. So we have some examples. I mentioned the 3 for 7s being very good for deck damage because you can imagine you swing for 7. Let's say they block with 2 3 blocks and they take 1. You've traded 1 card for 2 cards, and you've also gotten a point of life, which is also relevant to fatigue. We'll talk about how that factors in, but the big attacks are very good for deck damage. And if they have a 3 block and a 2 block, you'll get 2 points of life plus 2 cards, which is even better. So these big attacks are like kind of one of the most obvious examples of deck damage. I have a couple other examples. Maybe you send an attack for 4 and they block with 2 blocks. You're still trading 1 card for 2 cards. And you can technically do this on defense. I don't think it really comes up in Rosetta much, besides maybe like Seeds for Tomorrow. But an example from WTR would be if you block with an unmovable from Arsenal, a red one, blocking for 8, and you block like a Nimbleism on a Nimble Strike that is coming in for 8, go again. They've spent 2 cards, Nimbleism and Nimble Strike, for your 1 card from deck unmovable. Of course, like unmovable is a 2-card play. You have to pitch it, but the pitched card goes back to your deck. So in terms of actual cards out of deck, you're trading 1 card for 2 cards, and you are going up on. I guess you're preserving your deck health is maybe like a better way of saying it, but it factors into this whole like deck damage versus deck health concept.
Okay, that makes sense. You said that life matters as well. Why does the life matter here?
Life matters because you still have to kill your opponent, and if you are at 20 and your opponent is at 2, but you have the same number of cards in deck, the player with 20 life is able to take damage to keep cards in hand and present lethal, which forces cards out of their opponent's deck. So it doesn't need to be as exaggerated as like 20-2. It can just be like a slight life lead. But basically, you can roughly think of every 3 life as being worth 1 card, is kind of the baseline. And that's because most cards block for 3. So, yeah, and I think a lot of people kind of know this intuitively, that like you might be close on cards in deck, but if your opponent's at 12 and you are low, your chances of actually beating them and not getting fatigued are very, very, very low. So yeah, that's a good baseline. Is every card's worth about 3, and yeah, 3 life to a card is like a pretty good heuristic.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So I guess if you consider every card being worth about 3 life, there's sort of this interesting thing that happens where your cards in deck as well as your life total are kind of all part of the same life total when the game is about fatigue. So specifically, when fatigue is the primary way that the game is going to end, your life total and your cards in deck are linked to each other. And we're going to be kind of unraveling that throughout this episode as we talk about it. The biggest baseline is that a card is worth 3, but of course it depends on the card, right? Like some cards only block 2, and in your second cycle you might just know that you have 2 blocks, and similarly 3 for 7s might trade up on cards, especially if your opponent has 2 blocks. So not every card is equal, but as a baseline, cards are worth 3, and you can kind of think of your life total and your deck as like one shared resource, and you're trying to maximize the most of it. If you go to 0 on either of those, you're kind of out of the game, right? Like, of course, if you take lethal, you literally lose the game. But if you run out of cards in deck, you typically also lose the game eventually, at least. And you're trying to kind of like manage and balance your cards in deck and your life total to maximize the most out of both of them.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How do you manage these cards then? Like, do you want to give me some examples of like how you could do something like that?
Yeah, so I think maybe the biggest one is making decisions to trade your hand to hand value. So that's like, the classic, you add up your attack value, your block value. So you attack for 7, you block for 6, your value is worth 13. You might trade a little bit of that hand to hand value in exchange for having better deck health or being able to deal more deck damage later. A prime example of this might be, do you choose to block with red Fruits of the Forest, which is a 2 block? So you're converting that one card for 2 value immediately. So that's probably good because you don't usually want to IP yourself, right? That's usually bad fab fundamentals, leaving a card in hand. But sometimes when fatigue is on the table, especially if you have a life buffer, it's okay to overpitch that red Fruits of the Forest and save it for second cycle. The reason, or potentially arsenal it and do that, because you can later attack with it for 7 and then trade one card for 2 cards and on 1 to 2 life points or whatever it is. So maintaining those cards that are worth a lot and saving them for later to get more out of them rather than blocking with them when you can is a great way to kind of trade life total for deck health. Of course, you can only do this so much before you start taking lethal damage and you're just out of the game, or you have to block with all of your cards. And remember that while saving your fruits to second cycle might be very good, if you already have a red attack in that hand for second cycle, you're not going to be able to play both of them. So there is like some limit on like how many threats you want at the bottom of your deck, because you can only play with so many of them before you're going to have to start blocking anyways. And if you like sacrifice value now and then end up having to block with that red Fruits in the second cycle as well, you're like probably pretty behind.
Yeah, that typically means that you could have blocked for 2 on the first time you saw the Fruits of the Forest, right?
Yeah, because then you're just kind of trading hand value and you didn't get the deck damage later. So you're just kind of down value at that point. So you do need to actually be able to like get back to the card and play it out for that to come into effect and help you. And you also need to not just die to damage, right? Like you need to actually get to the fatigue end state. So you have to be very careful with how much you're doing this. And it just kind of depends on like how far through your decks are you, how much life total do you have, how at risk do you think you are of dying, and all those kinds of things. And this kind of shifts throughout the game. We'll talk about some questions you can ask yourself to kind of evaluate how you're doing. But yeah, you're kind of actively weighing your hand-to-hand value against your deck damage or deck health throughout the game. Do you have it like do you do the same thing, Jay? Or this is how I think about it. Do you kind of think about this the same way?
Yeah, I think so. I think in limited, it's a little bit, maybe it's a little bit more intricate. You don't actually know if a game is going to go to fatigue or not at the beginning of the game. Whereas in constructed, a lot of the matchups are kind of predetermined if you're going to go to fatigue or not. So you can plan for that beforehand. In limited, you kind of have to play a first couple of turns to see if you think it's going to go to fatigue. And the moment I have a feeling that it might go to fatigue, I would start asking for the count on my opponent's deck and then trying to figure out if I'm ahead, behind on deck damage, and then try and know the contents of my deck to see if I have like enough 3-for-7s or enough 3 blocks to really get myself ahead during the fatigue portion of the game.
Yeah. You can definitely think about this as like it's good to like kind of know like I have like roughly this many big red attacks. How many have I seen? How many are left? And like all those kinds of things are really good to keep a tab on, and you can kind of go, oh, I have 1 left. I'm gonna have trouble trading up on deck damage. That's kind of not good for me. Or actually I have quite a few of these left, and even if I draw multiple in a hand, I can maybe play 1 arsenal 1 and get most of my value out of them. So Yeah, and I think that's a good point about this being primarily this particular part being primarily limited, because in constructed you sometimes still need to preserve threats in deck or like make the most out of your key cards, but I feel like this like pitching your big attack for second cycle is like very much like a limited play. Like most fatigue here in constructed is more about like leveraging your power cards, right? Like in Aurora, you're trying to line up your arc lightning with your flicker wisp and create your big arc flicker combo, and that's like how you beat fatigue. And it's more about that than being like, oh, I gotta keep this lightning surge in my deck.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, the fatigue strategies are just much better at fatiguing people in constructed than in limited. So it's you have to do more drastic things or like put together power cards or add power cards in your deck to be able to beat fatigue. But in limited, you're quite literally limited to your options, but so is your opponent. So they're not gonna have, 4 copies of Rootbound Carapace Reds that would let them fatigue you out just by playing those cards essentially. And they also need to work on like maximizing their own deck. So if they're not doing that, you can actually out fatigue your opponent. That's trying to fatigue you, honestly.
Yeah, and you made a good point about the defensive cards, like your Rootbound Carapace blocking for 4. It's like that's better than a block for 3, right? You're getting a 4-point card without using your action point, which is really valuable because usually your best chances to trade are on offense. But if you can get an Arcane Polarity, a Rootbound Carapace red, a Seeds of Tomorrow can cover 5 for 1 card out of deck. Your Fertile Grounds can uh, heal you like 4 or 5 life. If you get the Verdant's Ping, it can be like 6 on the rad, which is a lot of deck damage for something that doesn't use your action points. So being able to deploy these defensive options is also really good for fatigue. And I think another reason why the Earth heroes tend to be better at fatiguing in Rosetta, right? They have the big attacks, they have the life gain instance, they have good block values. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay, and let's talk about one more thing that does contribute to deck damage, which would be your weapon. Um, in Rosetta, we only have Starfall and Rotwood Reaper as our weapons that can attack. But why does weapons contribute to deck damage?
The big thing is that when you swing a weapon, you're actually not using any cards out of deck. If you have the option to like attack for 2 with a card, or pitch that card to Rotwood Reaper and attack for 2, the Rotwood Reaper is more efficient, right? Because the Rotwood Reaper takes 0 cards out of your deck, your pitch goes back, but it still presents the same amount of damage too. So every time you swing your weapon, if it's Rotwood Reaper for 2, you're kind of going 0 cards for 2 value, which is like less efficient than throwing a 3 for 7, but it's more efficient than like playing your blue, I don't know, meet and greet or consuming volition than just attacking for 2. So weapons are very good. And in particular, Florian is often such a good fatigue deck in Rosetta because 4 for 0 cards out of deck is kind of incredible. Like it's not literally 0 because you need some way to turn it on, but you often get some extra value out of it. Like like the Sigil of Deadwood. You play the Sigil of Deadwood, you swing for 4, then you get 2 Rune Chance, and you get a swing for 4 again. And that was like 1 card out of your deck, and you've done 9 damage over 2 turns, which is, or 10 damage over 2 turns, which is just like really, really, really good, right? And there is like some limit on like the number of turns you get because you also have to do some blocking at some point. But yeah, that weapon is really, really strong, and we've seen the same thing with like Guardians in the past having Anathos or Titan's Fist is just like, that number 4 is so good for fatigue because you're actually trading like 0 cards for like more than a card, because even if they give you a 3 block, they're still leaking 1 damage. So yeah, that number 4 on the weapon is like super, super good for fatigue. But also stuff like To Go Again from Aurora is pretty good too if you can do it every turn.
Yeah, I think the just like the baseline of being able to preserve cards to do some number of damage is the most important fact here. And one other thing to keep in mind about weapons is just having a weapon that deals damage means that once both players are at 0 cards or 1 card each, essentially, means that as long as your weapon can deal damage by pitching a card, then that is a win con in its own. So you kind of want to know if both players have 1 card each and they're just swinging weapon and not blocking each other, who's winning that race, and at what point do you have to be at to win that race. So, for example, if Florian and Aurora is playing against each other, if both players have only 1 card each, neither player can block anymore, and both players are just going to be pitching their last card into their weapon. Florian's actually going to be doing 2 damage per turn now, and then Aurora can only do 1 damage per turn. So you know that Florian is going to be ahead on the fatigue race, essentially, if both players are at 0 cards. And you kind of need to know this so that you don't get into a spot where you are losing as the Aurora once you are at like 1 card each, essentially.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And this is also part of the reason we emphasized perennial Aether Bloom in the Verdance episode, is because with Staff of Verdant Shoots, if you get to surge your perennial Aether Bloom and to put it back on the bottom, that's effectively 0 cards out of deck, and you've kind of built your own weapon that you can keep using. And for a deck that is an Earth Hero and can go to fatigue because maybe it's not quite as good at pushing damage, having a way to have something that is weapon-like is super, super valuable. So that's like basically why that card is so important in Verdance.
Mm-hmm. Well, it does deck damage, essentially.
Okay. Up next, we have the idea of blue 3 blocks. I think anybody that listens to the show regularly knows that Jay is like the biggest fan of blue 3 blocks. I like my blue 3 blocks, but for Jay, it hits a little bit differently. Do you want to tell us a little bit about why blue 3 blocks are so good in fatigue and like how to think about them?
Yeah, sure, that'd be great. So blue 3 blocks are, I guess it's not exactly blue 3 blocks that I like. It's more that I liked having a density of blue 3 blocks. I think is a better way of saying it. I guess people can easily understand that if you have a blue 3 block in your hand and a blue 2 block in your hand, typically what you would do on your first cycle will be to block with the 3 block and then pitch your other blue, so then you can proceed with your turn. But if you have a density of blue 3 blocks, what ends up happening is you would end up pitching your 3 block, the blue 3 block, and then also blocking with your other blue 3 block. That means that the card that you pitched is going to go back into your deck and you'll draw it back later in fatigue scenarios. And in the first scenario where you pitch the 2 block, that means you're going to draw back the 2 block and you'll most likely need to block with that 2 block again. But then if you have more 3 blocks that you can pitch and draw back later, that means we go back to the scenario where you want about each card to be worth 3. When you block again with the pitched 3 block, you essentially gain 1 extra life than if you were to have to block with a 2 block. So the more 3 blocks you have, and the more blue 3 blocks in particular that you have, means that you get to draw it back up and block with it again.
Yeah, I was just going to say that something that we've talked about previously on the episode is the idea that like maybe even like another way of reframing it is like it's not just gaining 1 more life each time you do this. Blocking for 3 instead of 2 is like a 50% increase. So if you, for example, if there's an attack for 6 and all you have is 2 blocks and that attack is lethal, you need to give 3 2 blocks. But if you have 3 blocks instead, it's only 2 cards out of your deck. So literally like every time you have 2 more 3 blocks, you're just like up an entire card compared to if those were 2 blocks that you were blocking with. So over the course of the game, this adds up like very, very, very quickly. And I think that like the 1 point can be deceptive, right? Like, because you're just like, oh, it's just 1 damage. It's not that much damage. But like, no, like you're blocking for 50% more. That's like half a card extra, which is like so much, right?
Yeah. And typically blues, you don't actually want to play your blues except, we have the exceptions of like cadaverous tillings and the strength of the four seasons. Okay, those cards are fake blues, whatever. The like the typical blues are like, if you play them, you kind of feel behind because they're less powerful. And what actually doesn't change on these blues are the block values most of the time. So when you look at a card that's, for example, meet and greet red and meet and greet blue, it's actually just like much more efficient to block with a blue 3 block than it is to block with a red card. And that is just maximizing your, essentially, your deck damage or your deck health. And you want to keep your reds, even if they're 3 blocks, in your hand because you want to be doing the most amount of damage. And playing your blue actually doesn't do that much damage to your opponent. So the best thing to do with them is typically blocking with them. You just like gain more by having your blues all be 3 blocks than not.
Yeah, and this gets even more amplified by a deck like Florian, which has a weapon, right? Because that that blue meet and greet being 2 is the same as Rotwood Reaper, except it takes a card out of your deck. So you would always just swing Rotwood Reaper. So essentially, like the blue can either swing your Rotwood Reaper for 2, or just like block for 3, and it kind of like has the flexibility to do both. So a lot of your blues end up being like, outside of those like outliers, like the cadaverous tillings, the strength of 4 seasons, that those attack for 6 and they do trade for 2 cards. A lot of your other blues don't necessarily trade up on cards. They instead just swing the weapon, and you eventually may have to block with them if the game goes long enough, and just every time you block for 3, you're up value. So
And I think like a great example of this is my favorite deck to play in Constructed, which is Dash IE. My Dash IE slab deck is filled with blue 3 blocks that are literally Titanium Bauble, Whispers, and Sift, which they all are just a blue strip 3 block and nothing else really. There's also about 10 other cards in the deck that are just purely 3 blocks, and that deck can win constructed games. So that's saying something, I think.
yeah, they're really good. And I like this last bullet you have here. You say the more times you leak damage, the more cards you'll need to give up later in the game to stay alive. I think that's another way that this manifests that people don't always recognize, is that like, if you didn't prioritize 3 blocks where you could have, and maybe you took some more 2 block blues instead because you got them late picks or whatever, if you had to block with that 2 block and lose a life, that might be the difference of being able to keep one more card or not later in the game. And I think everyone can relate to being in that spot of like, if I had one more life and I could keep one more card, my turn's so much better and I might be able to win this game. So that's the other way this can manifest too, is like not just in fatigue, but also just letting you keep cards on those crucial turns, to swing the game in your favor.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess for that reason, just for the last bullet point you just talked about, it technically doesn't have to be blue 3 blocks. It just has to be 3 blocks over 2 blocks.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. And this is part of why in the Verdance episode, we talked about like kind of like 15-ish Earth cards being about the maximum. Maybe you can go slightly up if you have a lot of Autumn's touches, but like most of the Earth cards block 2. And just having like all 3 for 7s, if they all block 2, you're actually losing deck value because you end up blocking with a bunch of 2 blocks. So you actually want a mixture of 3 blocks in there, even if they're like, your yellow zaps that aren't really cards that you're hoping to play, aren't the best cards to pitch because they're a yellow, but they still block for 3.
Or more because of Embodiment of Earth.
Yeah, or more because of Embodiment of Earth. So true. What's even better than a blue 3 block is a blue 4 block. Ready to move into our last section here?
Yeah, let's move into our last section. So this is key questions to ask yourself. Is this what you would usually ask yourself, Yuki?
Yeah, these are things that I'm usually thinking about before the game, during the game, that help me kind of manage fatigue. And I think maybe we're going to be drawing on those concepts that we've touched on previously, but I think it's like really important. This idea of like thinking about the questions that you should be asking about, or thinking ahead about like, these are the things that are important in the game, these are the things I need to be considering, is honestly like so important in card games in general, and I think there's a lot to do with in fatigue here. So we're going to kind of go through some of the questions I wrote down, and I'm going to be curious to hear if you ask yourself similar questions or if you have any other ones. But first thing I do, I'm sitting down, we reveal our heroes. I'm already thinking, how likely is this game to go to fatigue? If I'm playing the Florian Mirror, that game's probably going to fatigue, right? Somebody could win with Rune Chance, but the game's probably going to fatigue, and I need to at least be thinking about deck damage, like probably from the start. Maybe if my deck has like a ton of arcane and I think I can cheese my opponent out with it, then like maybe it's an exception. But for the most part, your Florian Mirror probably going to go to fatigue. On the other hand, your Florian against Cecilio, or honestly just like any deck against Cecilio, that game's probably not going to go to fatigue. Wizard cards don't do great deck damage, and Acilio starts on less life, and he's just often trying to burn you out with evasive damage. So in those games against Acilio, all this stuff that we talked about this episode, you can pretty much just like throw that aside and just focus on your hand-to-hand value and just getting the most out of every card. An example of this would be, play your Fertile Grounds that only heals for 2 on your first cycle just to convert your hand and get that 2 more value now, rather than trying to pitch it for second cycle and be like, oh, I can get 4 health later. Like, the second cycle doesn't matter. You're probably not getting there. And if you are getting there, you're probably ahead. So you just need to get your hand-to-hand value now. And I think it's really important to kind of ask yourself that and kind of inform your play of like, I'm going to play towards fatigue, I'm going to play towards value, or in some cases, there's like a bit of a balancing act and I need to kind of do both. I think that like New versus Enigma in MST was kind of like this. Like you could fatigue, you could just die, you kind of have to balance them.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, I think I'm very similar to this. I typically think about this even before hero reveal. During deck construction, I'll be thinking about if my deck is even good in fatigue or if it can win in fatigue, and then that would also determine if I want to get into spots where fatigue could matter, or if I want to like push the game in a way where I don't want it to go to fatigue. So like even if it's like taking extra damage to try and push extra damage.
Yeah, that's a good point. I actually do this too. And you mentioned a good thing there. Is my deck good at fatigue? What does a deck being good at fatigue look like?
I guess my number one thing would be like density of 3 blocks. If you just don't have a density of 3 blocks and you're going to be in the situation where we explained before that you have too many 2 blocks in your deck, and you're going to be in your second cycle drawing up into like a hand that blocks for 6, your deck is not going to be good in fatigue because it's going to be too easy for your opponent to rip your hand apart, which means you won't be able to play the game after second cycle. Similarly, if you just don't have big attacks in your deck, then you're not going to be able to rip your opponent's hand apart if their deck is not great in fatigue. So I guess an extreme way of framing this would be if you don't have any big attacks and all of your cards block for 2, you're probably not winning in fatigue.
Yeah. And then the more big attacks you have, the more 3 blocks you have, the more you have cards like the Fertile Grounds that can convert for 5 without using your action point and get you more deck damage, or the auras that let you swing Rotwood Reaper. You have your Harvest Season, gain 3 life, swing a Rotwood Reaper for 4. That's like another 3 for 7, right? So all those type of cards make you better in fatigue. And there's like a little bit of a sliding scale there. So I think as you play a format, you kind of start to calibrate and go, this is about what an average deck is. I think I'm about average or maybe above average against fatigue, or maybe below average against fatigue. And then you start to get a feel, but it's always, I think, a little contextual to the format.
Yeah, that's true.
So the second question I'm asking myself, and this is during the match, is who is ahead on fatigue? Right now, who is ahead? And there's a couple of things to do here. So the most basic kind of heuristic I can give you is if you count the number of cards in each deck, that gives you an idea of who's ahead on cards in deck. So for example, I have 9 cards, Jay has 7 cards. This is counting arsenal, cards in pitch, cards in hand, count all the cards. If I'm on 9 cards, Jay's on 7 cards, I'm up 2 cards, right? But that's not the whole picture, because we talked about life lead being important. If Jay is up 9 life on me, well, every 3 points of life is a card. So even though I might be up 9-7. If I add Jay's life total in, he's kind of on like effectively 10 cards. So I'm actually down one card here. And you can include equipment on this as well. So if your equipment has blocks and you have 3 block on equipment and your opponent doesn't, that adds to your life total. And you can just incorporate that the same way. And this is a pretty good rough indicator of who's ahead on fatigue or not. There's some things that swing this, like how efficient your second cycle is. And if you keep trading up on cards and if your opponent doesn't, that can start to pull you ahead or make you fall behind. And also, there's a little bit of like, because attacking is good on deck damage, you'll often be like if you're even on fatigue, when I'm attacking you and threatening like 2 cards out of your deck, it's like I'm gonna probably pull ahead after that attack resolves, but then it's gonna go to your turn and you're gonna swing for 7. You're probably gonna pull slightly ahead, and we're probably gonna trade back and forth. And at some point, like somebody will do something else more efficient, and it won't keep trading evenly. But if all you ever do is swing 3 for 7 and block for 6, is gonna kind of like swing back and forth depending on whose turn it is. So being the active player is also worth. I don't know if it's like worth like a card, but it's worth like at least something.
Yeah, I think just having the action point is worth something.
Are you thinking about this throughout the match too? Who's ahead on fatigue, and do you think about it in the same way?
Yes and no. I typically don't count each card as 3 points of life. Sorry, I don't count 3 life as each card. Typically, I think it's closer to maybe like 2 points per card is what I like thinking about. Just because in at least in limited, I would think about 2 points per card because cards become very inefficient very quickly, mostly if both players' deck are going to be filled with blues. And the thing that I said earlier about a lot of people pitching their blue 2 blocks. So you can kind of get to a point where in the late game, where most of your opponent's cards are actually going to block for 2 instead of 3. And that's how I think of it, is like if I'm up, 8 life to my opponent's 6 life, I'm kind of up a card on them as well.
Yeah, I agree. It's not exactly 3 points. It's like probably somewhere between 2 and 3.
Mhm.
But I think either way is pretty. Yeah, as long as you're using some kind of idea like this, I think it is going to give you a good indication of who's ahead. I guess the other question is, okay, you are behind on fatigue a little bit. Let's say you notice it early. You're starting to fall a couple cards behind on fatigue. What can you do about it, or how does that affect your gameplay?
Oh, that's a good question. I think our discussion about weapons come back into this, and swinging your weapon more aggressively will be a good way to try and swing this back, even if that means sacrificing a little bit of the value of your turn cycle, essentially.
Yeah. You're trying to just do like whatever is like the most efficient in terms of like a cards from deck perspective, and that can try and catch you back up. This might also mean like over pitching some reds and saving them to make sure you can play them and catch back up. And I guess the other opposite end is you go, oh, I'm behind on fatigue and I don't think I can catch up. Maybe I really need to set up some kind of big turn and just try to kill them. And that can be your other game plan that sometimes comes up. I think that's a little bit less common in Rosetta Limited specifically. Like for like the Earth Mirrors, it's kind of hard to do this with all the life gain. Verdance sometimes can with the arcane damage, but that can also be a consideration that you might need to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's true. I guess a common thing for Verdance is like maybe not blocking with your blue and activating the Verdant Shoot instead to try and make the game about the actual damage instead of deck damage.
Yeah, that's a great example actually, because then you're kind of like, if you're not blocking for 3, you're trading 3 value now for 1 value, but the difference is that 1 value doesn't take a card out of your deck, and it could be worth maybe more than 1 value if you get the embodiment and you get to get an extra block out of your embodiment. So Staff of Verdant Shoes is a great way that Verdants can kind of like start playing more for deck health, and this can even be on like your life gain triggers. It doesn't have to be on a spell. You could go like Staff of Verdant Shoots, Feindel's Fighting Spirit. That's one that I really like actually.
Also, not blocking put your life total lower than your opponent too. So honestly, that play line is so good.
Yeah, it's very, very, very good. So that's something you can do, and it's like another reason why your life total is so important in Fatigue, right? Because you get to make more plays like this if you have the life total, and you can kind of like juice your deck value more because you're ahead on life. Yeah, and then I guess if you're ahead on Fatigue, it gives you more opportunity to play for current value and just kind of like get tempo. So this maybe ties nicely into our next question, and that's sort of weighing like what's important in this game right now? Is it more about my hand to hand value, or is it more about the deck damage and deck health? And which one is should I be prioritizing? Some of this has to do with like, is the game headed to Fatigue and who's ahead on Fatigue? But the reason that this is so important is that, well, if you kill your opponent, you win the game outright. But maybe even more than that, if you can present lethal and get tempo and force your opponent to block out, you're effectively taking a turn cycle away from them where they can trade up on cards. So if you're able to like even if like you're dealing a bunch of arcane damage and they have to sanctuary, you're like they have to sanctuary a bunch and block for 3, and then they're not going to have any cards left, that's usually really good for your fatigue because they don't get to swing their Rotwood Reaper or swing a 3 for 7 or do whatever they want. You got to trade up on cards, and then you kind of get to trade up on cards again the next turn, and that can be a really big shift in fatigue. So sometimes playing that hand to hand value and being like, actually, I can get tempo here and just force cards out of your hand is really, really good. Yeah, so there's always this trade off, and you want to preserve decks. You want to preserve your threats in your deck, but you don't want to go so low and have such a small life buffer that your opponent can just get tempo and then hit that card out of your hand in the end game.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
Do you have any other questions you ask yourself during the game or things you're thinking about that help you kind of manage fatigue, or have we mostly covered it?
Think that's about it. Nothing that I can think of right now.
I think we've more or less covered it. So maybe I can just give a quick overview of all the things we talked about just to kind of refresh everyone's memory before we sign off here. So when you're thinking about fatigue, we're mostly talking about fatigue by damage. Remember, your deck damage is trading up on cards in deck, and this is kind of the key concept we were talking about today. Weapons are really good for trading up on cards in deck. Blocking for 3 versus blocking for 2 is a great way to go up on deck because you're getting more value out of each card. Things that are worth 4 value and don't use your action point, also good for fatigue. Big attacks, good for fatigue. And then ways to manage this fatigue during the game is asking yourself before the game starts, and maybe even during deck construction, is the game likely to go to fatigue? Am I good in fatigue? All that kind of stuff. During the match, you can ask yourself who's ahead on fatigue. You can do the count the deck and life points and then figure out the difference. Every 2 to 3 life points is worth about a card. Remember to include your equipment in the account. In the count. And then finally, think about whether the current value hand to hand or the deck damage long term is more important in this particular spot in the game. And this can often be relevant for like getting tempo and forcing your opponent on the back foot so that they can't trade up on cards on their turn. Yeah, so that's pretty much everything. Kind of wanted to cover this because I think it's actually like super, super relevant in Rosetta Limited and was kind of relevant in like heavy hitters and MST2. I kind of feel like it feels like the trend lately has been in limited. These kind of fatigue concepts are at least like sometimes useful, and like going to second cycle and maintaining the cards in your deck is like pretty crucial. At least in some matchups.
Yeah, I think in MST, Mistvale had like preserved tradition, which kind of did this without you having to pitch it. And there were like other cards like the Enigma headpiece that like put cards to the bottom of the deck so you draw them later, and it was kind of like built into the card. Whereas in this format, Rosetta, you kind of have to do it yourself. You have to pitch it, and there aren't any cards that kind of shove a card to the bottom of the deck.
Yeah, that's super true. That's a really good point. I think that's going to wrap us up for today then. Hopefully, this helped you out. There is still one more week of PQs when we're recording. I guess by the time people have listened to this, PQs will be over though. So I hope that all your PQ seasons went well. I know a lot of people have been I don't know, just enjoying this format, both CC and limited, from what I've heard. So hopefully you've been enjoying it as well, and hopefully this will help you out in the future. If you are going to Worlds, or maybe one of the callings coming up, like calling Portland or Chicago, best of luck at those events. And I'm certainly going to be at those events. I'll see you there. Are you headed to any of these big events coming up, Jay?
I'll be there in Portland for sure, and I might be in Chicago, and I won't be playing the main event. If I go to Chicago, I will definitely be playing the History of Draft event that the MinMax Games are hosting, which is a cool event. It's a 64 player capped event. It's the whole weekend long, and you play 9 drafts total. So if I can make it out to Chicago somehow, I definitely want to sign up for this.
Yeah, I've seen a few patrons talking about this in the Discord, and it does seem like a really really sweet event. I'm almost like, oh, I want to play this, but also Living Legend seems fun, so I'm a little bit torn. They both seem like very cool events, to be honest. Okay, well, that's going to wrap us up. Thank you all for listening. If you want to get in touch with us, you can find us on Twitter. Jay is at J. I'm at Bender, and our email is onthebobble@gmail.com. So if you want to get in touch with us or send feedback or questions, you can do so. If you want to submit questions to the show, we had one listener question today about the Runaways equipment. You can do so on the Discord, on the Patreon Discord. So feel free to check us out on Patreon and take a look at that if you'd like to submit your own listener questions, or just chat with us or other members of the community about Limited, about Constructed, about anything Flesh and Blood, really. You can check us out there. But that's going to wrap us up, and I wish you all the best at your upcoming events. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Do you want to talk about the night at the Armory experience, or the recording, or the commercial that you were in?
Yeah, so there was a commercial. I think it was premiered during the 5th anniversary LSS stream for Flesh and Blood, which was a pretty fun stream overall. It was right at the start of it, and it's also its own video. So if you haven't seen it and you want to check it out, you should just be able to search Night at the Armory or look at the Fab TCG YouTube, and you should be able to find it. Seems like overall the ad's been like pretty popular. A lot of people have been talking about it. I've seen even some like Magic players talking about it, which is cool. Filming this was a lot of fun. We filmed this in LA, and there's like some big names there in the ad. I'm in the ad. Pablo's in the ad. Pablo Pintor, of course, and then Brody Spurlock is also in the ad, and there's also a bunch of familiar faces in the background as extras. This was honestly such a cool event to be a part of. So 3 Floating, who honestly just, I think, put out the best content, at least in terms of like production values and entertainment value. Their stuff is just like really really impressive. A bunch of them have like a theater background. They're really nice guys. But this is put together by them, and yeah, they kind of had like a whole film crew there. They had a script and everything. They got us in. They invited us right before the pro tour to come hang out and invite some of our friends. So like I have a bunch of my friends and teammates there, and some of the others do as well. And like they're basically like, yup, just it's an armory. So just like sit down, play cards. We might be a little bit particular about when you trade off so that, there's continuity between the shots and people are still playing the same opponents. But like we basically just got to like hang out, sit there and test pretty much all day with just like minimal interruptions and stuff like that. And it was just like really cool to be a part of. It was like, I think it was awesome that they got the players involved, and it was very cool that they kind of, it felt like they cared about, they understood that we're coming up on the pro tour and that we wanted to prep, and they were kind of like tried to be respectful of our games as much as they could while still trying to film their thing. So yeah, it was just like honestly a great experience. I had a really good time.
Oh, that sounds great. My favorite part about the ad was my favorite part about this ad is that we usually joke in like just our regular friend group that Whenever I introduce Yuki to like my actual friends or like my personal friends, um, I go up and say, "Oh, this is Yuki Lee Bender, 2021 Canadian national champion," and I just list up all of her accomplishments in Flesh and Blood because it's just what we do. And
And we do it to like everybody. Like we have magic friends who have results, and we do the same thing to them.
yeah, like Namdang, the 2025 world competitor, which is next year's competitor, and like things like that. It's like a little, what is it? What would it call? A gig? Not a gig. A
Bit.
skit? A
It's a
bit?
bit.
It's a bit. You're
Yeah.
right. It's a bit. But my favorite part is that now I can just show the screenshot of when Yuki comes up, and it says Yuki Lee Bender and all of her accomplishments on the right side. That was my favorite part about this video.
Yeah. After it aired, I got like pings in the Discord from people that don't play Flesh and Blood, and they're like, "Is that famous actress?" And I'm like, "Oh no, not like this."
The famous actress Yuki Lee Bender. Oh, amazing!
Yeah, yeah,
It's
people
great.
did enjoy that.
Oh man, yeah. I had a lot of fun sharing it with all my friends.
I'm glad you also enjoyed the video, Jay.
Yeah, it was great. It was great. Um, do we know who the actors are from that video? I'm actually not sure who they are. But
So yeah, the main character is one of the three floating guys. Um,
oh, okay, I see. I see.
yeah, yeah. So they were all like Sam and Jacob were in the video, and um, they were kind of like maybe the main two characters, and then they kind of played against some of the members of the community as well. But they were kind of like the main people with like the acting roles. Like Pablo Brody and I were kind of like mostly just playing Flesh and Blood, and there was like a little bit of direction about like do this or whatever, but it was like mostly playing Flesh and Blood, whereas they had more of the actual like dialogue and other things going on.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. The I was gonna ask one more thing. What was the last thing I was gonna ask? Oh yeah. I think the number one rated comment on that video was like, imagine Yuki being 01 and Pablo being 02 at an armory.
Yeah, yeah, it was like a pretty stacked armory. Um, I don't know. Some of these things do happen sometimes, though, especially around Pro Tour. Like I remember going to a skirmish after Worlds in Barcelona at like it was still like a skirmish in Barcelona, and there was just like so many names from like all over the world at that skirmish. It was like probably just like one of the most stacked skirmishes like ever. Um, and you definitely saw some of that of like just like great players losing because just like maybe not like there's definitely like some locals, but like there's like so many strong players in the room that like somebody has to lose. So definitely not something that would come up at your typical armory, but sometimes leading up to events you do get some pretty wild um, attendance. And I wonder if there will be some of that with worlds coming up in Osaka and Japan. I know that, like for example, we have PQ weekend coming up, and I think some people are already there and going to go to PQs. So there might be a little bit of that going on in the coming weeks.
That makes sense. That makes sense. The My other favorite thing is in there's a Vancouver Discord for Flesh and Blood, and one of the locals, Eric, says links the video and says, "Oh, this is a pretty close. This is pretty close to how it feels. Like LSS did a good job capturing my local experience, and it's like meeting Yuki in the 01 bracket at Armory."
It's true. I will say that I do go 01 at Armory kind of often. Like I don't know. Um, it's like one of those things. Like you play at your locals all the time, and they get better because they play against you, and then they just like beat me all the time. Not to say like I can't win against them, but just like my locals can definitely take games off of me. Lots of them can take games off of me. They do take games off of me. I think you've probably had the same experience. I feel like when we started drafting, it was like, we're so far ahead on draft. We have such a big edge, and then it's like, oh, everybody's catching up. Now the games are so hard. You like play the PQ, and it's like, oh, why are these games all so hard?
Yeah, like all the Swiss games are so hard. It's actually difficult to top 8.
Yeah, yeah. I was like stressing during the draft PQ. I was like, oh, I don't know if I'm gonna make it.
Yeah, because most games end up with like 1-0, right? Coming down to the
Yeah,
last card.
yeah, yeah.
uh, it's a struggle. It's a struggle. It's okay. No, but still, the killer is the Oh, I listened to your podcast. I've used what we were talking about this episode or something like that, to beat you, Be like, I play red brush off twinkle toes, prevent 5, and you just go, oh man, that was game winning for them. And they go, I learned it on your podcast. Oh, I see.
Yeah. Honestly, it's like awesome. It's like one of my favorite parts is hearing from people in the community and, people being like, oh, I top 8 in my first PQ, or like whatever. I won a PQ for the first time. Um, just like seeing people get better, seeing people get excited about limited is really, really rewarding. And I love it. And I'm glad that we do it. But yeah, sometimes you lose to people and they're like, oh, I learned everything from you. I'm like, oh no, I'm beating myself in some weird way.
Okay, I think we should wrap it up here.
Yeah, I think that's been enough. If anybody's even still listening. Um, all right, it's going to wrap us up. Thanks for listening. Have a good night, everyone.
All right, good night.